So, Shang Tsung is a character that wants to keep your opponent away from you. He's extremely good at range and uses his projectiles and long-range abilities to keep his opponent at bay. In general, your main goal of Shang Tsung is to make sure your opponent doesn't get close to you. Now, there's a couple different variations you can use that sort of change how drastic your range is as Shang Tsung, but overall, this is the general concept of how you're going to play him. Before we take a look at a couple custom variations I've made for Shang Tsung, we're going to dive into a little bit more depth on how to play just the generic character. So let's start with his projectiles. After all, Shang Tsung is primarily a zoning character. Your back forward one is your main projectile as Shang Tsung. It's pretty fast, you can amplify it to do a second one right afterwards, but it does go high so your opponents can neutral duck underneath of it. You also have Corpse Drop, which is your down forward 3. This is an extremely fast starting overhead projectile, which is something you don't really see a lot of in Mortal Kombat. You can even choose where on the screen the Corpse Drop lands depending on what directional button you have held down at the end of the ability. Just using these two buttons alone makes Shang Tsung an extremely good zoner. But what makes Shang Tsung go from good to great at range is his ability to deal with your opponent's projectiles as well. We'll go into this in a bit more detail when we go into the custom variations. So now you know what to do at range, but what happens if your opponent does get close to you? Well, here are some good strings you can use as Shang Tsung. 1-1 is your fastest combo starter as Shang Tsung and is generically what you're going to be using in most situations close range. You can chain it into 1-1-2, which pushes your opponent back, even on block, or you can go into 1-1-4, which is going to be your primary combo starter. Back 1 into down 2 is a mid into an overhead and can trigger a crushing blow if the overhead chop hits by itself. Forward 2-4-2 and forward 2-4-3 are going to be your advancing moves as Shang Tsung. Forward 2-4-2 is plus on block, and forward 2-4-3 can actually trigger a crushing blow if you use it as a counter or a punish. You can use back 3 into down 4 or back 3 into up 4 to make your opponent guess if you're going to be doing a low or an overhead. Your forward 3 as Shang Tsung is an extremely good advancing overhead. You can't combo into anything off of it, but it's still really good to use just to get a little bit of damage into your opponent. And finally, if you're under pressure, your down 1 and down 4 are your best moves to take your turn back. So, now that you know the basics of Shang Tsung, let's get into some custom variations for the character. The first custom variation is going to utilize Shake, Exploding Corpses, and Ermac Lift.
So starting with Smoke Shake, remember when I said Shang Tsung had a really good ability that made him insane at range? Well, it's this ability right here. Not only are you effective at dealing damage at long range, but now you're effective against characters who can also deal damage to you at long range. Down back 3 is the command for the ability, and you use it to parry incoming projectiles, and you can also amplify it to parry basic attacks as well. If it connects, it teleports Shang Tsung to the opposing character and triggers an unblockable overhead. Hit it twice in a row and it crushing blows. This move is insanely good. I highly recommend using it, as when you try to zone out people in Mortal Kombat, most of the time they'll also try to throw projectiles at you. You can just straight up counter that with this ability. Force Lift is your basic combo extender. I would recommend using it after 1-1-4 or forward 2-4. You do have to burn some meter and amplify Force Lift in order to get the extension, and I would just recommend ending the combo with down 2. It's the most consistent for beginners. Finally, Exploding Corpses lets you amplify Corpse Drop. It can pop your opponent up in the air to get some combos off of it, but mostly just used for a little bit of extra damage at range. The second variation I'm going to talk about, and is my personal favorite variation on Shang Tsung, is if you want to be a full degen zoner. This variation still keeps Shake because of course it does, it's the best move in the game. Your last 2 slots in this case are going to go to Ground Eruption, which is going to be your down back 1. This ability shoots skulls up from the ground. If they hit your opponent, they actually carry them away from Shang Tsung, which is extremely good if you're a zoner. And it can be amplified to do 1 more attack up in the air, and it can also be comboed into, so this is a really strong move to be used at range or in a combo close range. Oh, and before I forget, you can also do this at mid-range, or you can actually, if you hold forward at the end of this, it does a longer range version of it. With this variation, you really want to stay at range. Not having Ermac Lift kind of cuts out the mid-range aspect of this one. You're not totally useless close range with this variation. As I explained earlier, Shang Tsung still has some really good strings to use at close range no matter what variation you're running. But if you really want to go full force into zoning, this is definitely the variation you're going to want to be using. This variation requires a little bit more execution for the combos, but overall it's still not very hard to do. This variation isn't as combo-centric as the one with Force Lift, but if you still want to do some combos with this variation, just replace where you use Force Lift in the last explanation. Just use Ground Eruption instead. It's easy, I promise. Yeah, and that's pretty much how you play Shang Tsung in under 5 minutes. This gives you the generic idea of how to play the character, as well as 2 custom variations you can play around with. Hope you guys learned something, go online, have some fun, and get out of training mode.